Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, my name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am an educator at the museum. And this morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Stephen Kovary, a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, who will share his story with you. Before we begin, I would like to share a few quick words about the museum. Our museum was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure this tragic history would always be remembered and that people could learn from it. In the early 1960s, the Holocaust had only ended about 15 years earlier. This group of survivors was unique because they were doing this at a time when most people were not yet ready to face this tragic history. But thanks to their courage and foresight, we have a Holocaust Museum, which was the first and oldest Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust Museum in the United States, always with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. This morning, early afternoon, we have the honor and privilege of listening to Stephen Kovary share his story with you. And I'm happy to introduce him as he is active with our education programs, and he speaks on a regular basis to students, teaching them his family's personal story is part of our mission. And so we can't do the work that we do without our survivor community that speaks on a regular basis and shares their stories. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And as a reminder, those watching on Zoom, can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And those watching on Facebook can type in questions in the section, and we'll answer as many questions as possible after the talk. Stephen, again, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's an honor and a privilege to speak on every occasion. Because I feel it's so important to educate about what happened before, during, and to some extent even after the Second World War, a large part of which was the Holocaust, which is the primary focus of my talk. My talk will comprise three parts: my own personal experience as a Holocaust survivor. I was very young. I was a 4-year-old. I don't have any tattoos, and I'll to share with you. And that's a story by itself. The second part of the talk will be I'll go into a story that unfortunately is rapidly sinking into oblivion, and yet it should be in the forefront because it's such a large story of one man's mission of humanity. And that gentleman's name is Raoul Wallenberg, my hero, and I believe the greatest humanitarian of at least the 20th century, but possibly in history. The third part of my talk, time permitting, will give you a timeline of the history of what led up to the Holocaust and the conclusions that we can draw from some of the events that took place between what happened then and what's happening in our midst, and actually what happened fairly recently in our history, and how unfortunately history tends to repeat itself. So maybe we can start, Michael, we can tell my story, part one. I was born in Budapest, Hungary. In,
sorry, would you share the PowerPoint now?
yeah.
Okay.
But I'll continue. You can put it up, and I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1941. And I was a happy little kid growing up, spending my childhood with my family, who were rather prosperous on my father's side of the family, with a shoe manufacturing business and marketing. And then on my mother's side, the family was actually living near Bratislava, Slovakia, today Slovakia, in a little town called Piešťany. And they had a manufacturing plant near Bratislava, manufacturing home appliances, namely stoves, gas ranges. And give you an idea, recently on a visit to Hungary, I went through a kitchen, and to my surprise, looks like the brand lives, because some of the appliances bore the name Balcony, which was the brand name. So at least to that extent, my that side of the family lives on, name only. My father and my mother, this photograph was taken shortly after their return to Budapest from forced labor. You might note that my father was kind of chubby. The suit he's wearing is pretty loose on him. He was twice recruited or forced into forced labor, which is a euphemism, was really safe slave labor. He served 2 tours. My mother served 1 tour. I can tell you that both of my parents were somewhat damaged, but it's nothing unusual. Most Holocaust survivors are damaged goods to some extent, including myself. We're all damaged goods. My father, unfortunately, was damaged beyond repair, and he died very relatively young, at a very young age. He was 59 years old when he passed away in 1958, I believe. And so, like I said, I had a happy childhood where we certainly were not lacking in means. And then my father in late 1943 was taken away, although he did return in in April 1944. He spent several months, the intervening months, in a Romanian forced labor camp, where he witnessed many horrific things, and things were so horrible that the camp commandant could not, in good conscience, keep the prisoners and let them go. And that allowed my father to return to Budapest. And then in around September of 1944, they took me. They were again drafted, and they dropped me up along the way to the recruitment point, or the meeting point of the prisoners, because essentially they were prisoners as slave laborers. On their way, they dropped me off in King Street in Budapest, This was a safe house set up for children and under the auspices of the Swiss Red Cross. I dare say I directly owe my life to the Swiss, and in particular to the Swiss diplomat Karl Lutz, who was second in command in the Wallenberg organization in saving as many Jewish people as they could. So my parents left, and suddenly I was by myself. I was less than 4 years old at the time, and the happy days were over. I was in an institutional setting, although I fondly remember my caretaker named Piroshka. English translation would be, you might laugh or smile, Goldilocks. She took good care of me, and to this day, I've avoided my life because after the war, I tried to, as a child, reconnect with her, and my parents didn't feel that was important, and I've never been able to reconnect with her, even though I tried many times. Every time I go to Budapest, I approach the Jewish organization in Budapest and float ads, but to no avail. So I have no idea what happened to her. The rest of my story in about February, as far as my stay at the Swiss safe house, is that about in February of 1945, suddenly my grandfather appeared. He was kind of a halcyon, a curmudgeon type of a guy, one of the funniest, most educated person I ever met, who never attended a university. And he picked me up. He found me after the Russians invaded Budapest, and this was even during the fighting. He went looking for me, and he found me, and he took me out of the safe house and took me back to the apartment building that we owned on Okatsa Street 58. And I stayed with them. My parents were still away. Eventually, my parents returned from Sopron, which is the northwest corner of Hungary, right near Lake Ferto, close to the Austrian border. And just give you a couple of incidents that happened during the time I spent with my grandparents. This was the time when Budapest received a pretty good shellacking, repeated bombardments. The sound of the sirens was an everyday event. And one night we went down to the usual hiding place, because my grandparents did have a hiding place. Otherwise, they would have been taken away. But they created a little cave in the basement that was never found out. And we're there hiding from the bombs. And when the all clear was sounded, we tried to nudge this heavy iron door to come up to come out of the cellar, and we couldn't move it. And so we were pounding on the door. Eventually, somebody from the outside came to our aid, opened the door, and I came upon a scene that lives with me to this day, which was a scene of carnage in the courtyard, with dead soldiers, German and Russian, strewn all over the place. And one of the reasons we couldn't open the door was because a number of bodies were stacked against the door. And there was a roll call of the Russian soldiers in white camouflage. Eventually, the commander motioned to us towards the trash cart and commanded us to start picking up bodies. And we did. My grandfather cautioned me, this is kind of humorous, that stay away from the Germans, they're too well fed. Pick the Russians, which we did. And then we proceeded to take them to this plaza called Clausthal Plaza in the 7th District, where they were unceremoniously dumped into mass graves. And we made repeated trips. And along the way, a Russian lorry passing out bread. And of course, hunger was a real issue. So I joined the rest of the urchins chasing the lorry and yelling on top of our lungs, chleba, 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 which is bread in Russian. My limited vocabulary in Russian. That's one of the first words I learned in Russian. Later on, I learned about davai chasi too, which was something else. I don't want to get into that. When we finally we returned, and eventually my parents showed up. They had to walk most of the way from Sopron to Budapest. Most of the Hungarian population was, of course, hostile to Jews, whether they were prisoners or not. There was no sympathy. And so they traveled by foot, which is roughly, and it took them about 3 days. Roughly, it's probably a couple of 100 miles, roughly. I'm not exactly sure, but I would say that's probably a good approximation. Not a small feat. And I was reunited with the parents, and then the aftermath came communism. We lost all our properties, a number of apartment buildings throughout Budapest, and everything was nationalized. My poor father was reduced to one tiny shop on Elizabeth, on the Ring, which became Lenin Ring, formerly Elizabeth Ring, and where he eked out a living, forever in dread of the communists, whether they'll take away his final means of survival. And then came the revolution of 1956 that found me actually in Slovakia, and we returned to Budapest. I was with the junior water polo team, and we arrived at the eastern terminal or depot, and we found the city in shambles, the revolution going on in full force. And along with my teammates, we went to man the barricades, but I also witnessed some atrocities, this time from the revolutionaries vis-a-vis the dreaded AVH. I saw, a carnage that I don't want to get into the gory details, but it deeply affected me, even though they're dead, and they were, who knows what kind of sins they may have been guilty of. They were basically massacred, and that had an impact on me. Shortly thereafter, my father found out that I was at Republic Square, and that I was interviewed on French television, and they told me that it could be, there will be retributions if the Russians ever return, which they did. And on December 6th, 1956, I took the world in my neck with the sports sack, with my swimming gear. Because, you know, I was a kid, so swimming was an important part of my life. And some Hungarian currency that my parents gave me, and with two friends, we boarded a train, again at the Eastern Terminal. That train actually proceeded to take us west towards the city of Győr, near the Austro-Hungarian border. And we deboarded the train near the border. We found some farmers who we paid with Hungarian currency to guide us through the minefields, which we did. And by then, the Russians, at least the Hungarian border guards, were back on the border, and tracer bullets were flying left and right. So most of the journey was on our stomachs, crawling along until we were able to ford this little rivulet, a little stream actually, that we crossed. And next thing we heard, some soldiers call us out, welcome to Austria, in German, of course. And we're taken to this little village, Wiener Neustadt. I'm sorry, Deutschkreuz, from where I ended up in. That was a transit point to Vienna, and then Wiener Neustadt, Munich. Next thing, I found myself in New Jersey in January 5th, 1977. And that was the beginning of my life, a new life in the United States. Maybe if Michael, if we can go back to the PowerPoint. This is the picture of my hero. Wait, I'm sorry, I do get emotional whenever I talk about Raoul Wallenberg. It takes me a few minutes to get over. It's a good portrait of him, because I really owe my life to him. And I will say that of the roughly 200,000 plus Hungarian Jewish people who survived the Holocaust, directly or indirectly, they all have Raoul Wallenberg to thank. Of course, me included. I will get into the full story of the Wallenberg story a little later. Next frame, please. This is just on the right, on my right is Raoul Oscar Wallenberg, who's a naval officer, Wallenberg's father, and May Wallenberg's with Raoul Wallenberg, because May was the mother of Raoul Wallenberg. And next frame, please. And then this is on the left is the young Raoul Wallenberg, and on the right at age 3. I think at this time I want to get into the significance of Raoul Wallenberg to my story. Raoul Wallenberg was a son of a scion. He was a scion of probably the wealthiest and most influential Swedish family who had interest in banking, shipping. They were diplomats. his grandfather, Oscar, was a ambassador to Russia, and they also had holdings in steel manufacturing, steel magnates, I might add. And so he was he comes from a righteous family who he was just one member of. His grandmother was considered the angel on the Russian front. She was responsible for during the Spanish flu, which is, of course, bears, it's relevant to where we're going through right now. She volunteered as a nurse and saved countless lives. She herself contracted the disease, overcame it, and returned and continued her humanitarian ways. So this is really the background. And Wallenberg eventually graduated from high school and studied architecture in the United States at University of Michigan, and then eventually returned to Sweden and as an architect, and was responsible for a number of architectural creations, some of which still exist. And then he eventually was enlisted in the diplomatic corps and spent tours in Mexico. And part of his tours included a tour in Haifa, which is back then was the Palestine. Was Palestine. Today, of course, it's Israel. And he witnessed some horrific acts by the Arab population versus Jewish victims. And he also, from German refugees, learned about some of the horrors that were taking place in Germany and Poland in the concentration camps. He had full knowledge of this. With this background, eventually returned to Sweden and joined a gentleman named Laur Kalman, a Hungarian expatriate with a successful business in Sweden, with involved in international trade, and enlisted Raoul Wallenberg in his business, and basically as an economist and expert in foreign trade, because of his contacts throughout the world. Wallenberg also served many tours, some tours in South America, besides Mexico and Haifa. Laura Kalman was instrumental in approaching American organizations about the demise or the horror that's befalling the Hungarian Jewish population. And he was he took up his cause with the War Refugee Board and a fellow Norwegian a Norwegian gentleman by the name of Ivar Olsen, and the World Jewish Council to arrange for an effort to rescue what remained of the Hungarian Jewish population, which was almost exclusively in Budapest. And that was the remnant of what was a total Jewish population that was In Budapest alone, there were roughly 750,000 Jewish people out of a not quite 2 million population of the greater Budapest. So about every third person in Budapest was Jewish. And at this point, they were still still intact, mainly through the machinations of the governor of Hungary, who was not an angel, but I'll get into a little more detail about him later on. But he was instrumental in preserving what was left of the Jewish population, although he was instrumental in the deportation of 1 million Jews from the countryside. So after this, Laurel Kalman was entrusted with finding someone who could be sent to Budapest and start the rescue effort. Kalman chose Raoul Wallenberg for this task. And preliminary to this, the Swedish diplomat on July 1, 1944, his name was Per Unger, he was attaché, and Carl Ivan Danielsson, Swedish ambassador, requested a personal audience with Miklos Horthy, Hungary's governor, and they delivered a message from King Gustav. I would like you to, I just want to share a photograph of King Gustav with you. Although I don't know if a photo means much, but Michael, can the picture be seen on the photograph? Is it?
Yeah,
is
maybe
it visible?
maybe hold it a little bit back. Okay, that's perfect.
Okay, so King Gustav, the telegram, and I'm going to read this telegram. It's in French, so I have to translate. But this telegram ultimately was the beginning of the saving of what remained of the Jewish population. Having witnessed the extreme measures that your government has committed against the Jewish population of Hungary, please permit me to personally address Your Highness or Your Excellency and pray in the name of humanity to take measures to undertake the saving of this unfortunate people, meaning Jewish people. This appeal to your heart, to your generous heart, is dictated my sentiments, my friendship towards your people and your country, and my sincere wishes to preserve the good reputation of Hungary in the community of nations. Let me see the date. This was July 1. 3 days later, again in French, Horthy's response. Sa Majesté Gustav, Your Majesty Gustav V, King of Sweden, Stockholm. I have received Your Majesty's appeal, and I would like to address your telegram in the spirit of total understanding. I pray to Your Majesty that I will do everything within my power to respect the principles of humanity towards the unfortunate people referenced in your telegram. And I wish I send you my evidence of my friendship towards your Majesty, and in this time of need and trial of the Hungarian people. And it's Nicholas de Horthy, Regent of Hungary. So this was the beginning of the undertaking, this telegram from the king to the regent. And so I just want to give you a little background on Miklos Horthy. He was the commander of the St. Stephen dreadnought, which was sunk on its maiden voyage, with most of the crew lost at sea in Fiume, na Rijeka in Croatia. In 1919, with French help, he removed the nascent communist government who conducted the infamous Red Terror from power and became premier of the Hungarian kingdom, inflicting his own version of terror referred to as the White Terror. In fact, a pogrom. During his reign, about 1 million Hungarian Jews were sent to their death from the countryside before he realized that he may be charged with war crimes. In the event, the Germans lost the war and began sabotaging the quote-unquote final solution. The Germans retaliated and sabotaged his son István's plane, causing his death, and then ordered the infamous Otto Skorzeny to kidnap Horthy's son, Miklos Horthy Jr. And then he wanted to save his son's life and signed a proclamation making the fascist Arrow Party as the new Hungarian government. Horthy later remarked on the signatures, "I neither sign nor appoint that Szálasi, which was the new premier, as premier. I merely exchanged my signature for my son's life. The signature wrung from a man at machine gun point can have little legality." Miklos Jr. was consequently sent to Dachau concentration camp, where he was liberated by the U.S. Fifth Army on May 5th, 1945. And my further research actually turned out it wasn't really Dachau, but it really doesn't matter. It was a different concentration camp, but he did get liberated and survive the war. So these are two pictures of what we're viewing is Raoul when he was 16 and at age 3. The next frame, please. This is a picture of Wallenberg counseling his team upon his arrival in Budapest in 1944. On the timeline is July 9th, 1944. He arrives in Budapest with a plan of issuing false documents to Jewish applicants and to purchase real estate to house protected subjects. So what he did, they set up, they bought up several hundred apartment buildings throughout Budapest, which were designated as safe houses they were flying Swedish, Swiss, Spanish, various other flags, which were off limit to the Nazis, who themselves were, most of whom sort of saw the handwriting on the wall and in the interest of survival were cooperative, because we're talking about the second half of 1944, and the Russian troops were not too far away, where you could almost hear the sound of the cannon and bombs falling. Next frame, please. These are two pictures of Wallenberg. where on the left is with his secretary, Mrs. Falk Laszlo, Laszlo Falk. In Hungarian, it's first and last name are reversed. And then the gentleman on the right was a mechanical engineer, but served as his chauffeur. And they both disappeared after the war on a meeting with Russian brass in the town of Debrecen near the Eastern Front. This gentleman by training was an engineer, mechanical engineer. To give you an idea, July 9, 1944 is when Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest. And the plan included issuing false documents to Jewish applicants and to purchase real estate, housing, quote unquote, protected subjects. He enlisted the diplomatic sympathizers, mainly Karl Lutz, who was the Swiss ambassador who personally is responsible for saving 62,000 Jewish lives through use of 8,000 protective letters and repeat, which he was authorized to issue, but he took it upon himself to repeat from number 1 to number 8,000 many times. And in addition, he saved 10,000 children transported to safety. There was also Carlos de Lis Tejera Braquinho, the Portuguese consulate, and Angel Sanz Briz, the Spanish minister, who was responsible for saving approximately 6,000 Jewish lives by issuing false documents under the auspices of the respective diplomatic legations. And he actually subsequently received the Cross of Merit from the Republic of Hungary. There's also Angelo Rota of the Apostolic Nuncio of the Holy See, Giorgio Perlasca, Italian businessman working for the Spanish embassy, Friedrich Born, the Swiss delegate, Shion Sugihara of the Japanese mission, took it upon himself to issue 6,000 visas, which he wasn't authorized to do. And upon his return to Japan, he died in abject poverty for his deeds. So this is just some of the mechanism that during his brief time in Budapest, he undertook, and he organized the diplomatic corps who was sympathetic, and he wasn't squeamish about whatever measures and whatever costs it took to save as many Jewish lives in Hungary. So at the end of the war, approximately 220,000 Jewish lives were saved of the roughly 1.5 million, 750,000 Jews who lived in Budapest. Most of the lives were saved were residents of Budapest. Obviously he couldn't save everybody, but he did. What he did was nothing short of spectacular heroism on many occasions, endangering his life and some of those assisting him. On February 17, 1945, Wallenberg was summoned to Debrecen, which is on the northeast part of Hungary, by Marshal Zhukov, which ultimately turned out to be his kidnapping. They kidnapped him. And then under murky circumstances, he disappeared, and eventually it became clear that he died of a quote unquote heart attack at the infamous Ljubljana prison in Moscow. Just in conclusion, Oskar Schindler saved about 1,100. Well, Actually, there's an exact number, 1,111 Jewish lives in inhumane conditions. Wallenberg's efforts resulted in the saving of more than 200,000 Jewish lives. Schindler is revered. Wallenberg is fading from the public's memory and conscience. This injustice must be changed. It is my duty to bring back his heroic deeds, the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century, in my opinion. Just want to give you an idea of the timeline of Hitler's reign and how it connects with Wallenberg. The Burial Hall Putsch took place November 8, 1922. December 1922, Hindenburg appoints Franz von Papen as chancellor, but Papen shortly thereafter resigns due to Nazi pressures. And then Hindenburg appoints Kurt von Schleicher, an army general, as his chancellor, who tried to stop Hitler by appointing Gregor Strasser to be his vice chancellor. Hitler forced Strasser to decline. In January 1933, von Papen and Hindenburg in defeat turned to Hitler to be chancellor. The mistaken belief they could control him. And upon Hindenburg's death on August 2, 1934, Hitler grabbed both offices, that of president and chancellor, giving him total control. And the beginning of the end is on Kristallnacht, November 9, 1938, is the beginning of the wide open persecution of German Jewish population, and is considered to be the beginning of the Holocaust. So this is I am obviously, I could talk for hours on end about some of the heroic deeds and what happened in Budapest, but obviously there are time constraints, so maybe we can go on with the remaining pictures. This happens to be what Wallenberg did is he set up safe houses under the auspices of Swedish diplomatic corps. So all of a sudden, Swedish diplomatic houses sprung up throughout Budapest, and that's one of the means he used for protecting the Jews who were housed in these under fairly crowded conditions in these apartment buildings. They were off limits because they were under the they were diplomatic residences. They were off limits to the Nazis, although it wasn't a fail-safe. There had been instances of invasions. Next frame, please. And these are some of the apartment buildings that were converted into residences of hidden Jews. One on Bourgeois Street, the next one is Katana Jozef Street. And the next one, actually the next is a memorial building which is named after Wallenberg. Next frame, please. Rolf Andersson is the Swedish ambassador who was enlisted who heroically stayed his post in Budapest, even in the face of bombardment, and he was at personal risk to help Wallenberg undertake the effort of now by now it was the entire Swedish diplomatic corps. And on the right is Count Fogh Bernadette, the president of the Swedish Red Cross, and the whole effort actually was under his command. Next frame, please. This is, now we're in Sweden, namely in Stockholm. And this is up on my visit and paying homage to Raoul Wallenberg. This is the Wallenberg Memorial. I'm sorry, every time I see, I get emotional. Forgive me. And this is it's a simple memorial attesting to the difficulties and the hardships, but that the effort took to save as many Jewish people as possible. Next frame, please. This particular piece of the memorial is, of course, in multiple languages. And then these are the escaping figures. These are very, very subjective memorial that's in a plaza in Stockholm, right next to the Great Synagogue of Stockholm. Next frame, please. Now we're in Budapest, and this is the rear of the Great Synagogue of Budapest, in Dohány Synagogue of Budapest. Next frame, please. And this is the Wallenberg Memorial in Budapest. This is on the premises of the Great Synagogue. This is a memorial to the great Swede who saved conservatively, directly, about 100,000 lives, and indirectly about close to 250,000 Hungarian Jewish people. Next frame, please. This is the memorial on the banks of the Danube River to the Jewish people who were murdered by the Nazi regime during the roundups. Budapest had about 750,000 Jews living in the greater Budapest area. About 225,000 survived. Practically all of them through the efforts of Raoul Wallenberg and his organization, and the diplomatic effort that he undertook. What they would do is line up people here on the quay and shoot them in the river, and that's what these are actual shoes that were bronzed of victims. Next frame, please. And this is the memorial. Each leaf represents a victim of the Holocaust, Jewish victim, Hungarian Jewish victim of the Holocaust, mainly from Budapest, who he could not save. And next frame, please. Just a leaf, the engraving of the name, an approximate or sometimes exact date of demise. And the next frame is the Great Synagogue of Budapest, and it's in the courtyard. In the back of it is where the memorial is that we just saw. Next frame. Next frame, please. This may be the last. This may be the last frame.
Yes, that is the last one.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned that really there are 3 parts to my talk. I just want to reiterate one of the conclusions is that I may be at the expense of repeating myself, that Oskar Schindler saved he saved 1,111 Jews under inhumane conditions. Oskar Schindler saved, and Wallenberg saved 200,000 plus Jewish lives. Schindler, I'm not trying to begrudge, but he's revered. And Wallenberg, unfortunately, is fading from the public's memory and conscience. And this is an injustice that must change. It is my duty to bring back into focus the heroic deeds of the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century, in my opinion. I don't think there are too many people around who could claim to have been instrumental in the saving of 200,000 plus people, Jewish or otherwise. I mentioned that there is really three parts to my speech. I want to go back to the happenings of what happened in post World War, during World War II, because Hungary. I'm going to get into what was instrumental in saving the Jewish lives of Hungary. Nicholas Horthy was the governor. I believe we have I've already mentioned his role in the elimination of roughly 1 million Hungarian Jewish people, and he was somewhat complicit in this. And most of the people who, under his reign, who met their demise were from the countryside. And but pretty soon he realized that the war was not going very well. He was not. He was somewhat of a bigot, but he was not necessarily an anti-Semite. He believed in white supremacy in a way, and he believed in the purity of the Hungarian people, which is kind of a falsehood, because there's very few people, Hungarians, who could claim to be pure Hungarians from the original conquest over 1,000 years ago. There are minor pockets still in Romania who might claim to be from the descendants from this Asiatic people, but he had this fantasy, and so he was going to save the people of Hungary. And of course, Jews did not fit his definition of pure Hungarian, so he was complicit in the deportations of roughly 1 million Hungarian Jewish people to their ultimate death. But towards the end of the war, he realized that the war is he's on the losing end, and he was also realized that what he was living was a lie and a fantasy. And the final solution, he saw the immorality of the final solution. And so he started to cooperate with Wallenberg and with King Gustav in particular, the King of Sweden. I read to you the earlier correspondence between Wallenberg and King Gustav. And he certainly implicitly encouraged the effort by Wallenberg and the diplomatic corps to save as many Jewish people as possible. And he in fact was somewhat instrumental in sabotaging the Germans' quote unquote effort at the final solution. For his efforts, the Germans retaliated and sabotaged his son István's plane, causing his death, and then ordered the infamous Otto Skorzeny to kidnap Horthy's son, Nicholas Jr. Horthy wanted to save his son and sign the proclamation making the fascist Arrow Party as the new Hungarian government, which he later remarked regarding his signature, is I neither signed nor appointed Szálasi Premier, who was the puppet of the German of Hitler. Says, I merely exchanged my signature for my son's life, a signature run from a man at machine gun point, can have little legality, and he was consequently sent to the Dachau concentration camp where he was liberated by US Army on May 5th. I'm not sure if Dachau is really, since then I discovered that it wasn't really Dachau, it was somewhere else, but it's immaterial. The point is that he started to cooperate, and eventually he was removed from power and exiled to first to Germany, eventually end up in Portugal. And it was really the Hungarian Jews in exile who were instrumental in saving him from facing war crimes tribunal. So I think hopefully I spoke long enough, and hopefully there's enough time for questions that hopefully I hope to be able to answer. And obviously these were troubled times that will never again happen in our lifetime or our children or grandchildren's lifetime. But of the roughly close to 3 million Jewish people in Hungary, only about 250,000 survived, which is a higher survival rate than most other countries in Europe, sad to say.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your story, your family's story, and for educating us on Raoul Wallenberg. We do have some questions for you. First question, what do you think drove Wallenberg to save Hungarian Jews while most of his colleagues in the diplomatic corps turned their backs on them?
I think a great deal had to do with his post in Haifa in Israel. He was stationed there before his return to Sweden in the employ of Laurel Kalman. He witnessed some of the atrocities that witnesses recounted, German refugees who came to Haifa from various parts of Europe. And so he already had foreknowledge of what was going on. And then when he joined Laurel Kalman, who was a Jewish businessman in Sweden, he came and through Laurel Kalman, who took it upon himself to undertake this last-ditch effort to save what's left of the Jewish population of Hungary. He was the natural person to undertake this, and he was, and he volunteered to do this, knowing full well that it's a dangerous mission. Eventually, costing his life unexpectedly at the hand of the Soviets, who took him prisoner, I believe February 17, 1945, took him to Ljubljana prison and kept him there for a ransom. They were trying to blackmail the Wallenberg's family, and of course the Swedes refused to give in to blackmail, and they eventually murdered him and make it look like a suicide. Hope I answered your question.
What is written on the concrete ball, the memorial for Raoul Wallenberg? Do you know what's written in all those languages?
Yeah, it's a dangerous journey. I wish I could go back to the globe, but it did say it's a journey. It's a dangerous journey, and it signifies the attempt at escaping that Raoul Wallenberg represented. It signifies the danger and the heroism that's involved in. Let's see if I can find either the dangerous, dangerous in danger, in full and full of obstacles. I'm reading in French now. Et plein des obstacles, lorsque des, I can't see it that well. So it basically the figures that are lying down shows the dangers and the obstacles that Wallenberg had to overcome to succeed in saving as many lives as he has, which is put at anywhere from 200 to 250,000, directly or indirectly. And I'll have to expand it to say that if you meet a Hungarian survivor, he was either directly or indirectly the beneficiary of Raoul Wallenberg's heroism. Hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much. The final solution in Hungary was huge, with so many people from to the guards at Auschwitz. Can you talk about how an entire country was able to mobilize and participate in such horrific crime?
Yes. Horthy, the governor, Miklos Horthy, was not a big fan of the whole thing. He was not a big fan of the Holocaust, and he actually dragged his foot as much as he can, but eventually, even though he was an anti-Semite, a virulent one at that, he was not a murderer, and he did see the immorality, but he did give in the interest of expediency, and he allowed the countryside of Hungary to be emptied of jewelry. But he did procrastinate as much as he could. He wasn't a big fan of this, the roundup. And he was very much instrumental in preserving the Hungarian Jewish community, which was around the Budapest and environs Jewish community of about 750,000 Jews, where really in Budapest, about every third person was Jewish. And it was not practical to extract the entire Jewish population of Budapest, because all the institutions would have collapsed. So he realized that, and he somewhat dragged his feet. although he did cooperate in the removal of over 1 million subjects, Hungarian subjects, who ultimately were exterminated, with few exceptions of survival. So towards the end, and it's largely to his passive resistance that I'm speaking to you, that he doesn't make no mistake, he was an anti-Semite, but he also often remarked that his shoemaker was Jewish, his tailor is Jewish, and even his cook was Jewish. So what's going to happen when all these people are gone, and who is going to perform the services besides, a quarter of the population of Budapest, a greater Budapest, will be gone. So he's also a practical guy. Needless to say, he didn't have a love for Jews. He was an anti-Semite, make no mistake about it. But he was also a practical guy. And ultimately, it was Jewish people who saved his bacon. I hope I'm not offending any Orthodox listeners, but obviously that's an idiom that describes what I'm trying to convey. So ultimately, he himself was kidnapped, kept in Germany for a while, and eventually found his way to Portugal, and that's where he died. Eventually, he got repatriated to Budapest, where he's buried in a mausoleum. But he was also, like I said, he was a practical guy, and he may have been he may have been instrumental in the death of. He may have been a murderer, but he was not necessarily a war criminal. So they did dismiss him from the Nuremberg trials, largely through the interventions of some of the people who he was instrumental in saving and rescuing. Hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. When you and your family came to the United States, what was it like to adjust? And
Well,
remind us, please, how old you were when you came here.
well, let me make a slight correction. I was 15 years old when I came to the US. I left Hungary with two friends and we went 3 different ways. I came to the US because I had some relatives. Another friend went to Brazil, and still another friend went to Australia. So I came by myself as a 15-year-old. I left Hungary when I was 14, technically, and arrived, celebrated my 15th birthday in a refugee camp in Austria. So I arrived, I was here and eventually placed with a family. But like I said, I was placed with a family who welcomed me. And like I said, I was by myself with I was underage. So the Jewish refugee organization, HIAS, placed me with this family in Santa Monica. And until I became an emancipated minor, and then I went to high school and finished high school. I started in Budapest, and worked, went to university, and the rest is history. So I don't know if I may have missed the answer to your question. I think I digressed. So my my family didn't follow me until I already had a career in aerospace engineering 8 years later.
When did your parents pass away?
Well, my father passed away in 1960, shortly after I left. Not quite 4 years after I left, 3 years after I left. And he was a very unhealthy person. The war has really destroyed him. He was pretty much damaged goods. My mother lived to be 92. She died in 2006, I believe, here in the US after I brought him out from Hungary.
Very much. What languages do you speak fluently? We can gather there's Hungarian and French.
Hungarian, French, English, fluent. I was fairly good at German, but I'm pretty rusty now. I must confess. And that's about it. Oh, I speak. Did I mention French?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. So as you settled in the United States with a career, at what point do you remember talking to people here, whether friends you made or anybody else, family, about your childhood and your family's experiences?
I made it my business, and don't ask me why. I made it my business to never discuss my Holocaust experience or the aftermath as much as I could avoid, and I did a pretty good job at it. And I pretty much removed myself from trying to think that I was a victim. I didn't consider myself one, although I was, but I never felt that there's any point in dwelling on it. About 4 years ago, a fellow survivor from Poland passed away, and I was at his funeral. And somehow during the service, I was seated next to the then president of the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum. I forgot the gentleman's name. The predecessor of the current, the lady who is currently the president. And we got to talking, and I shared with him that I'm also a Holocaust survivor in a way, although I never considered myself. And because I was a kid, I was 4 years old. Although I suffered the aftermath, anti-Semitism was never far removed. And he, like I said, I'm sorry I forgot his name, but he took down my name and number, and pretty soon I heard from him, and I was asked if I would be interested in sharing my experiences, and I thought, well, yeah, I don't have much of a story, and that's what I told him as a 4-year-old, but I'll do my best. And so since then, my focus was not so much my own personal experience, but the aftermath and also the Horthy era, and and most importantly the Wallenberg era and what Wallenberg has done, and it is my duty, since I owe my life to Raoul Wallenberg indirectly, although not directly, because I was in the Swiss Safe House for Children, is where I survived the war. but it would not have happened weren't for the arrival of Raoul Wallenberg. So it is my duty and my obligation to keep his memory alive and to shed light on the magnitude of what he has accomplished in the span of roughly 8 months, from I believe July 9th till February the 13th of 1945, from 44 to 45. I mean, what he's accomplished is an enormous humanitarian deed. And so that's how that, my inauspicious meeting with the then director of the Holocaust Museum actually opened up an area of consciousness in my ethos, that I have an obligation to deal with this period in my life and to let people know what a tremendous undertaking this was on the part of the Swedish diplomat and his enablers. Hope that answers your question. I tend to digress sometimes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You brought up a really important point. So you had assumed for all these years that you didn't have much of a story, but as we can all see now, anyone who listened to your story, you do have one, and your family had a story, and we're so happy that you share it with our community on a regular basis. Because in sharing this story of yours, you educate so many people, particularly students. You speak a lot to students, and you educate the community on not only what your family experienced, but on what Raoul Wallenberg did, and how we can keep that part of our history passed on, how we can continue to pass it on for generations. So we thank you so much. We have comments, people typing in thank you. Somebody said, your talk is very informative, even to a person who is familiar with the Hungarian Holocaust experience. So we thank you much for everything that you do for our community by sharing this on a regular basis. And just to conclude, what is one thing that you would like somebody listening today to take away from learning this story?
I think the most important takeaway is, obviously, what Wallenberg has done. His legacy is the most important takeaway. And, his selfless acts of heroism, and for which he paid the ultimate price ultimately, is the ultimate takeaway, in my opinion. Every other story dwarfs in comparison, although there are other stories that are just as important. Karl Lutz's story is a story second to none, but the Wallenberg story is the story here. It's the reason I'm talking to you. It's the reason I dare say that every Hungarian survivor, and there aren't too many, there aren't very many left. There are many of us left at this point, but the few who are still left, they all owe a gratitude to Wallenberg, the Swiss diplomat, Raoul Wallenberg. And we have saying this, saying that, and they saved a few people here and there. And I wish there would be a way to canonize Raoul Wallenberg, because he qualifies as a saint in my book.
Thank you again so much for sharing with us this afternoon. We appreciate everything you do for our community because you teach this story on a regular basis. And also, a couple of people were asking if this was recorded. Yes, anybody can access this recording on our Facebook page or on the museum's YouTube channel, Holocaust Museum LA. If you go on YouTube, you can find our YouTube channel, and this will be uploaded there shortly. But you'll be able to watch it instantly on our Facebook page. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much again, Stephen. And we hope you tune in next Thursday for our next public survivor talk, but please follow our website and our social media to see about our other virtual upcoming programs. And as a reminder to anybody watching who is in Southern California or will be coming to Southern California, the museum is now open again in person. So please follow our website to learn how you can reserve a space to come and visit the museum in person. Thank you so much, everybody, and wishing everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend ahead. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Bye-bye.